Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Kuf Yud Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Becky Goldstein in loving memory of her father, Chazan Yoel Ben Meir, on his Yurtzeit last Shabbat. He was a lone Shoah survivor in Canada, believing Hakol Tovah, and dedicated himself to Torah and Gvilu Chasadim. He gave advice spiced with midrashim and challenged my thirst for learning. He would be proud of the generation of Lamdanim in the family. He Zichro Baruch. Okay, we're going to get started today. Quick announcement. So again, the siyum is next week on Sunday. Looking forward to seeing everybody there. Monday will be your day to start prepping on the intro to Masechet Zevachim, Menachot. And we started yesterday advertising the Megillah Challenge, which is also starting on the same day as actually on Monday, next week. So we're getting ready for Purim, as we usually do every year, and give everyone an opportunity, if they want, to relearn or spread to others to get them into learning Gemara. This year we're going to do it a little less intense than last year, 4 days a week only. So we're starting early so we can get them finished specifically on Purim, which is a nice day to do a siyum at your Purim Suda. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. So if you saw the information about it and you want to pass it along to people, it's a great way to get people into learning Gemara. Okay, ma bein bamot yachid bamot tzibur. We're starting at the bottom of Kuf Yud Bet and Bet, and we're finishing up the Mishnayot of the chapter. So we were talking about bamot yachid, bamot tzibur, private, your personal bamot, where people could just offer it wherever they wanted, versus the central one, which was the Mishkan. So when there was a time of the Mishkan that we learned, let's say when Yov and Givon were around Gilgal, and there was a Mishkan, but you were allowed to do in the bamot, what were the differences between if I would bring my sacrifice there or I bring it there? So the difference is, and they're specifically talking about in a shlamim offering at first, smicha, ushchitat tzafon, umatan saviv. Actually, not just a shlamim, I realize, because shchitat tzafon happens in other offerings. If it was kodesh kodshim, like an ola, you would do it in the north only. But that issue of north is not relevant if you're bringing your own individual burnt offering. The smicha is what you do in a korban shlamim, where you put your weight on the animal. That also you only do in the Mishkan. You don't do it if you're doing it on your own personal bama. And matan saviv, you have to put on the chatat on all four corners, and the shlamim, well, there's no chatat here, because you don't do chatat on that. So in the other ones, the ola and the shlamim, if you remember, it's shtayin, shein, arba, you put on two corners, but it gets to all four. So you have to really get all around the mizbeach with the blood. You don't do that in a personal bama. Utnufa v'agasha. These are two actions that relate to menachot. So when you bring your menachot, if you bring a meal offering on the bamot, there's a waving of the offering that you do, and there's bringing it to the altar. You bring the whole dough to the altar. Neither of those are relevant in a bamot yachid. You don't need to do either of those two actions. Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? Ein mincha b'bama. There's no reason to mention these two things because he didn't think that you're allowed to do meal offerings on your own private bamot. He thought you only bring sacrifices, not meal offerings. We're going to get into all this later in the Gemara, toward the end of the chapter. V'kihun ubigdei sharet, v'klei sharet, v'reach nichoch, v'chitza l'damim, v'richutz yadayim, v'raglayim. These are also things that you do not need to do if you're on individual offerings, individual bamot, individual altars. Kihun, you don't need kohanim. Anyone can do the actions. Bigdei sharet, you don't, obviously if you don't need the kohanim, you certainly don't need, well, maybe not, maybe you would think you need special clothes, but no, you don't need special clothes. You don't wear bigdei kuna, or you don't need to. Klei sharet, right? Obviously if you're not a kohen, you're not going to be wearing the bigdei sharet, the bigadim anyway, but if, let's say you're a kohen doing an individual, you don't have to. Klei sharet, this we had a whole discussion, a whole issue of were there libations in the desert, and how that affected the way they were doing it when they got into the land. And that if they were doing it on the bamot when they got into the land, then, right, the whole thing is you didn't need klei sharet. Okay, you didn't need to put the mincha offerings into the klei sharet. So you don't need things to go in sanctified vessels in the bamot. Yachid and reach nichoch you don't need. Remember reach nichoch? We had this once during the Masechet, which is first you have to burn the meat before you actually roasted it in advance. Okay, because if you roast it in advance, just like, you walk by someone's house, you smell a delicious barbecue, right? That's when the good smell comes out when you're roasting the meat. If you roast it first and then bring it on the altar, you won't smell anything. So we want there to be this pleasant aroma, so we make sure that you burn it first. But you don't have to do that on the private altars. Umechitza l'damim. This is a separation in the middle of the height of the altar. This was the chut hasikra, if you remember, because there's bloods that go on the bottom part, bloods that go on the upper part. So you need that in the mizbeach, in the mishkan, but you don't need it in the small individual ones. And richutz yadayim v'raglayim, you have to wash your hands and feet before you do it. You don't have to do that if you're doing it on an individual offering. Ava hazman hanotar v'tameh shavim b'zeh b'zeh. But there are certain things that are relevant across the board. Zman, big debate what this is, but let's just go with it. It's pigul, because pigul is a thought that I'm going to eat it beyond the given time. And it makes sense as pigul, because pigul always goes with notar and tameh. Okay, it's a threesome that always goes together. On the other hand, why don't they call it pigul if that's what they mean? And that's why some people think it means something else. But anyway, pigul is an issue, notar is an issue, leaving the meat beyond the given time. And tameh, if you're impure and you're doing the sacrifices, that's a problem across the board. Now the Gemara goes back to the very first Mishnah, which makes sense. That's the way the Gemara works. And the first words were parat chatat shesarfa, or maybe shachata. We saw Rashi had a different girsa. The para aduma that was burned, chutz migita, okay, or the siyar mishtaleach that you offer outside. Both of these, if you do them outside, now we're going to have to see their designated area, okay. If it's the siyar mishtaleach, it's the fact that you offered it outside, you burned it, right? Which is not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to throw it off a cliff. And the para aduma is you're going to do it outside its gita, which we said was some sort of pit where they would do it. We don't really know what this is yet. That's going to be our real question. What is chutz migita? Now we have to remember this because it's a little confusing. You're not liable for doing it outside, right? And the reason given in the Mishnah, which we're going to deal with a little bit at the very end of Daf regarding the siyar mishtalech, is because it says al petach moed lo aviyah. It says when are you obligated in chutz, by doing something outside, when you didn't bring it to Petach Ol Moed where it was supposed to be done. Now these things are not supposed to be done Petach Ol Moed. The Siyar Mishalech is supposed to be thrown off a cliff outside. And the Paraduma is done in Har Zeitim outside the walls of Jerusalem. So they weren't supposed to be in Ol Moed, so that's why you're not obligated chutz. Okay, now what we're going to have to see is both these things, you obviously did something in a way it was not supposed to be done. And it's a problem. But it's not a problem of chutz. That's what's really important to get here. Okay, it's not a problem. This isur that we saw in the pasuk in Vayikra Yud Zayin, either in the first pasukim of slaughtering it outside their designated place, or in the next pasukim at the end of that section, Chet to Tehet, where it's offering it, burning it outside its location. Those pasukim did not apply to these issues. Now, it's not to say it's okay to do. So now we have to figure out, what does it mean, chutz migita? We need to find a place where it's not where you're supposed to do it, but yet we're going to say, but you're not chayav on chutz for it, okay? It might be problematic for other reasons. That's what's important to understand here. It's not like, oh, it's fine, you did it there. It's problematic for other reasons, but you're not liable for this particular commandment of don't do it outside. So the Gemara wants to know, my chutz migita, and the bulk of our daf is all about this machlok at Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Okay, and that's why I made a chart today on the study guide, which I'm not going to share screen, but you can follow along. It's something so necessary, but I thought it was just nice to organize it. We're going to have a machlok at Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, which we're going to say is based on some other machlok that they have. And then eventually we're going to have six difficulties, 3 that Reish Lakish raises on Rabbi Yochanan, 3 that Rabbi Yochanan raises on Reish Lakish, although it's not going to be that orderly, which is why I put it in a chart so you can see, because it zigzags, okay? So the chart will help you see which ones are difficulties on who. Usually the Gemara tells you, but once in a while they don't. And that's going to be the bulk of our daf. So what is chutz migita? Amar Reish Lakish. Again, we have to find a place where it's not the right place to do the para aduma. And again, the Mishnah is telling us, if you do the para aduma in that wrong place, you're not transgressing the prohibition of don't do it outside. Chutz mimakoma badukla. Outside a place that was checked for, you did it not in a place where you checked for impurity. If you remember para aduma, we're going to see this later, they were very careful about checking for impurity, like making sure nothing was done with any kind of impurity at all that would make para aduma waters, mess the whole thing tameh. So if you slaughter it or burn it in a place where you didn't check for tuma, that's what we're talking about. Chutz migita, outside of this pit where you didn't. The pit is where you checked. There's no impurity, and then you did it some other place where you didn't check. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan, v'lo kol Eretz Yisrael bedukahi. Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you mean? All of Israel is checked. As of course that area was checked for impurities before. There's no such thing that there's an area they didn't check. Now, it's very weird. What do you mean? Every area is checked for impurity? So it's a good question what exactly it means here, but we're going to see. What they seem to be concerned about is land that you checked, like the generally, underneath the ground, but not all the way down into the depths. And there's this concern, because there's something called kever tahom, which is graves that are deep, deep down from many, 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 many years ago, that maybe, there's graves down there that nobody knows about, okay? So that's what Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are going to debate. Is there a concern in Israel that there's graves deep, deep, deep under the ground or not? So we're going to see what this is all based on, but we're going to have to wait a little while to get there. So we're going to leave this issue right now, and we're going to move to what Rabbi Yochanan, he disagrees with Reish Lakish. So what does he think that tahom is? That chutz migita is. Ela am Rabbi Yochanan, kigon shachatan lefnim min chomat Yerushalayim. He just says you did it in the wrong place. What would be the wrong place? Where is it supposed to be done according to the Psukim? Outside Jerusalem. So if it's supposed to be done outside Jerusalem and you decide to do it inside Jerusalem, now remember, where is it done? On the Mount of Olives. Now, you might say that's Jerusalem, but no, it's not within the walls of Jerusalem that were at that time. Walls of Jerusalem were inside, right? They weren't, that was, Mount of Olives is outside the city walls. So if you did it inside the walls, right, it's funny, what's inside is now chutz, right, is outside. Because in this case, you're supposed to do it outside and you did it inside. And what the Mishnah is telling you, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is even though you did it outside the place where you're supposed to do it because you did it inside the walls, you're still not obligated for this prohibition, okay? Meaning you can't do it inside the walls. It's disqualified if you do it inside the walls, but not because of the law of chutz, okay? That's not where you're supposed to do it, but it's not chutz. Now, they say, wait, if you're trying to say that this doesn't have to do with impurity and you didn't check the place, like Reish Lakish thought, and it has to do with physical location, that's the wrong location. So why did Rabbi Yochanan specifically say inside the walls when he could have said what else is the wrong location? Do you remember what the pasuk says? It says that Lakach alazar kohen midama, he takes from the blood be'etzba'o. I'm in chapter 19 of Bamidbar, verse 4. V'hiza el nochach pnei ol mo'ed midama. Now, why did they do it on the Mount of Olives? Because the Mount of Olives is east of the Har HaBayit. And when you're standing east of Har HaBayit, you face the Har HaBayit. It says you're supposed to do the sprinklings and see. You're supposed to be facing the Har HaBayit and sprinkling toward there while you're looking there. So, can't you just say, you did it chutz l'choma shelo keneged hapetach. You did it outside the city walls, but on the northern side or the western side, right, where you can't see in. That could have been a good answer. Why did he have to say the chutz b'kita is inside the walls when he could have said it's outside the walls, but you're standing in the wrong spot where you can't see Oel Moed or the temple? Now, how do we know that this is a problem? Now, how do we know? Now, what you have to prove, and this is something that you have to keep in your head. All along, to get to a definition of chutz migita, what we need to find is something that's actually disqualified if you do it, but it's not going to be under this prohibition of chutz, right, of doing it outside. So, but it has to be something disqualified. So now, how do we know? Now, what we have to prove to raise this difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan is we have to prove that it's actually disqualified. Now, it's true, the pasuk says you have to do it facing all Moed, but what if you don't? How do we know it's disqualified? Well, they're going to quote Rav Ada bar Ava, who tells us it's disqualified. How do we know? Shneimar v'shachat v'hiza ma za'ata keneged hapetach av shchitata keneged hapetach. So here we have. Okay, now it's not exactly in the same pasuk, but it's juxtaposed two psukim one after the other. When it describes the process of the para aduma, it says v'shachat. This is pasuk Gimel. It's the pasuk right before the one we saw. Okay. You give it to Elazar Kohen, he takes it, El Michutz LaMachaneh, that's how we know it's outside Jerusalem, V'shachat ota lefanav, and he slaughters it in front of him. Now, then it says, and he takes from the blood, V'hiza, so it's actually not the next verb, okay, the next verb is V'lakach, but it says, V'shachat, V'lakach, V'hiza. We assume that all happens in one continuum, all in the same place. And from there, Rav Ada bar Ava learns that the slaughtering has to happen also opposite Oel Moed. This, by the way, fits in with Rashi's Nusach, that it's talking about shachatan, not sarfa. And then again, what would you see here? It's disqualified for a different reason, right? Because you just didn't fulfill it the way it was supposed to be done. If you did it not facing Oel Moed, and that's what the Mishnah is telling us, but you're not liable for chutz, for this law of offering something or slaughtering something outside. Now, if you want to say, maybe the reason why, and we're back to square one, or we're back to an earlier stage, which is, so why didn't Rabbi Yochanan give this example? Now, if you want to say, they're going to suggest something, immediately reject it. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan doesn't agree with this hekesh, and maybe he doesn't think that the slaughtering has to be done there, and that's why you didn't mention this. But but it was said, it's a little bit of a girsa problem here, but I'm going to read it anyway. Like I have this section in parentheses, but shachata shelo keneged hapetach. Okay, we're going to see now. There's a machloket about slaughtering. There's a machloket about burning, and in both cases, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say it's disqualified if you slaughter it. It's disqualified if you burn it, not facing Ohel Moed. And then we're going to be back to the question, which is, so why didn't Rabbi Yochanan mention this? Shachata, so this is just, the purpose of this is to bring the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan said somewhere else, that he actually disagrees with Reish Lakish on one, and he disagrees with Rabbi Yoshia on the other. And he holds that it's completely disqualified. And then that really strengthens the question. If he thinks it's completely disqualified, if you did it not facing Ohel Moed, why did he bring the example of you did it inside the walls when he could have brought the example, you bring it outside the walls, not facing Ohel Moed? Okay, which would have been a perfect example. So here's the machloket. Shachata shelo keneged hapetach. Rabbi Yochanan omer psula v'shachat v'yiza. Okay, exact same thing as Ravad Barava. He says v'shachat, and then it says he sprinkled, and the sprinkling has to be facing Ohel Moed. The slaughtering also has to be facing Ohel Moed, and therefore it's disqualified if you're not. Reish Lakish amar kshera. Why? Because he says al michutz lamachaneh v'shachat. In the pasuk about slaughtering, it says go outside the camp, meaning outside the walls of Jerusalem, and slaughter it. Slaughter it wherever, anywhere. So he doesn't think it's disqualified if you didn't do it facing Ohel Moed. The sprinkling has to be done facing Ohel Moed, but not the slaughtering. And obviously, right in the Mishnah, we weren't talking about sprinkling. V'itmar nami, and it was also said, sarfa shelo keneged hapetach, Rabbi Yochanan omer psula, Rabbi Yoshai omer kshera. Rabbi Yoshai and Rabbi Yochanan have the same debate about burning. What if you burn it not facing Ohel Moed? And it's the same basis of the machloket. Rabbi Yochanan amar psula, v'saraf, v'hiza. This is a little tricky, because before it was shachat, lakach, hiza. This one, it's hiza, and after, obviously, you sprinkle the blood, that's when you burn the para. So, it's the next pasuk after is v'saraf. It should have said v'hiza v'saraf, okay, in that order. But basically, pasuk dalid says v'hiza, facing Ohel Moed, you sprinkle the blood. Pasuk hey says, the next one, saraf et hapara le'enav. And then he does the burning of the para. You burn the para in front of him. Anyway, point being, v'saraf v'hiza, these two verbs are also juxtaposed, and therefore, just like sprinkling is done facing Ohel Moed, also burning. Rabbi Yoshai amar kshera. Why? He darshans a different thing. Al pirsha yischof. He says this word, which is very weird what it means, on pirsha, on its peresh. You will burn it. What does it mean, peresh? What do we mean by that root? Makom sheporeshet lemita. He darshans this. The place where it separates from this world by dying, meaning where you do the shchita, shante srifata, that's where you burn it. Now, we assume that Rabbi Yoshai holds like Rabbi Reish Lakish. It doesn't need to be slaughtered in facing Ohel Moed, and therefore it doesn't need to be burned facing Ohel Moed. It can be burned in the place where it was slaughtered. Okay, that was the side. We don't really care about Rabbi Yoshai and Rabbi Reish Lakish here. Our main point is Rabbi Yochanan. And why did Rabbi Yochanan bring this as an example? Why did he specifically say the case where the Mishnah is telling you you're not chayav in chutz is specifically the one where you did it inside Jerusalem? So now the answer is a little tricky because there's two issues going on here that I keep highlighting, but I want to highlight them one last time before we finish this section. One is we need to find a case where it's disqualified. Once it's disqualified for some other reason, right? Because the psukim say it's disqualified, like doing it outside the, not facing Ohel Moed, or doing it inside the walls of Jerusalem. Two disqualifications we've been discussing. One is the one Rabbi Yochanan mentioned, the other is not that one. And then the Mishnah is taking it one step further and saying, well, even though they're disqualified, you're not liable for halat chutz, shchitat chutz, okay, those two prohibitions. But if we focus specifically on the first part, which is what's disqualified, now if we want to think about what's disqualified, what's the bigger chidush? In other words, in the end, we're going to use what's called the lo mebaya structure. Amri lo mebaya kamar. The Mishnah is a lo mebaya structure. What is lo mebaya? I mean, you don't need to say this, okay? Meaning, lo mebaya chutz l'choma. Obviously, outside the walls, when it's not facing, is obviously going to be disqualified. Dirichu kerachka, because it's far outside Ohel Moed. In other words, you got two problems. Number one, you're not in Ohel Moed. Number two, you're not even facing it, okay? You're really distanced from it. That for sure you can't do para aduma there because you're missing like any connection to the inner sanctuary. Ela afilu, the chiddush of the Mishnah is, even lifnim in achomad, kiruve karve, ve'emet kasher. Now it does say do it outside the machane, but you might have thought, yeah, but if you accidentally did it inside, it's not so bad because, this one said do it outside facing Ol Moed. In that case, you're inside looking at Ol Moed, you're much closer. Maybe it's actually okay. Kamash Malan, that's why Rabbi Yochanan, the way he reads the Mishnah, in other words, Rabbi Yochanan saying, the Mishnah is highlighting chutz mikita because the bigger case, the more unique case of disqualification that is not as obvious is the one he mentions. So again, it's tricky because it's what we want to say is you're not obligated in chutz in that case. But what we're trying to say is you have to get to chutz, what you're not obligated in, first by something that's completely disqualified. And now they want to say, well, it's obvious that you'd be disqualified if you're not facing Ol Moed because you're far from it and you can't see it. And therefore, you're also, once you do that, well, yes, it's disqualified. For sure it's disqualified, but you're not going to be obligated chutz. But even in a case where you're not sure it would be disqualified, where you're inside, maybe, well, no. That's disqualified as well. And yet you're also not obligated chutz. Okay, and that's the way we read it according to Rabbi Yochanan. That's how we resolve the difficulty, that he really meant both, right? The question was, why didn't he say that case? He really meant both, he just didn't need to say both. He said the one that's the bigger chidush, at least in terms of which one's more disqualified. So he wanted to say, you might not have thought inside was disqualified, but it is. Amar Mar. But now we want to get to the real, say the meat and potatoes of today's sugya, which is big debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Did the flood in the time of Noach, did it get to Israel or not? Was the flood in Israel or was it everywhere in the world but not in Israel? Okay, that's a big debate that they have. Okay, if we had, you thought it was interesting, were there libations in the desert or not? We're having this whole discussion of what happened many, many moons ago. Now we're going all the way back to the flood. And did the flood take place in Israel or not? And that's going to affect whether there's graves deep under the ground or not. That's the big debate here. So they go back, Amar Mar. Okay, that's always a quote from before. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan, v'lo kol eretz Yisrael b'dukai. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, all of Israel is checked, and you don't have to worry about dead bodies under the ground. From where would they be coming from? So, b'mai kamipage, what's the root of their machloket? Mar savar yarab mabul eretz Yisrael. Umar savar lo yarad. Okay, one held the mabul came to Israel. Okay, that's Reish Lakish. And since the mabul happened in Israel, the flood happened there, there's a likelihood there's buried deep down from many, many, many centuries ago, right? From all the way back to the flood. And Rabbi Yochanan held, no, there was no flood in Israel, and therefore there's no dead bodies to be worried about all the way down in the depths. Okay, why that's the only concern for dead bodies, I'm going to put that question aside, okay? Why there weren't dead bodies from any other time, but that seems to be, you can imagine, the Mabul, all the more so, right? Bodies are going everywhere, they could be buried super deep down, and therefore, that's the question here. Okay, there's also a question, generally non-Jewish bodies don't have tumah. Okay, there's a whole bunch of questions on the sugya, we're not going to get into them today, though. Okay. Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak. Ushneim mikra chad darshu. They both actually learned it from the same pasuk. It's a pasuk in Yechezkel. Okay, when you hear the words Ben Adam, usually it's Yechezkel. Ben Adam and Morla. So Yechezkel is told, go speak to Israel and say to her the following: At Eretz. Okay, you're going to see the problem with this pasuk in a minute. You're you land. Okay, or At Eretz lo metohorahi. You're a land that is not pure. I'm reading it literally. Lo gushma b'yom zam. There was no rain on you on the day of anger. This pasuk can't possibly be read the way it is because it makes no sense. You're not pure because there was no rain. It should be the opposite. You're not pure because there was rain, or you are pure because there was no rain. But you can't use both no's to be literally no because it makes no sense. Okay, so each one is going to interpret one of the no's as yes. Okay, like no, there wasn't. A rhetorical question, and the other one as there was none. Okay, literally. So let's read both interpretations. Rabbi Yochanan savar itmueh matamaka. The pasuk is asking the land a question, right? You're Eretz lo metorad. What? You think you're not a pure land? Of course you're pure. Eretz Israel mi lo metorad. What? You're not pure? Of course you're pure. Because, now read the end of it, literally, lo gushama b'yom zan. There was no rain on you, right? Klum yardu alecha gshamim b'yom zan. What, did there come rains on you? No, there were no rains on the day of anger. And therefore, of course, you're pure. That's obviously Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish savar kipashte. Now, it's tricky because it's not really kipashte. Both of them have to ask a rhetorical question. But he reads the beginning as pshat, okay? Eretz lo metohorat. You are not a pure land. Why are you not a pure land? Now, it's tricky because there's lo gushama. There was no rain on you. This part he reads rhetorically. Milo yardu alek shamim b'yom zan. Did the rains not come to you on the day of anger? Meaning, of course they did. Okay? There you have it. Now we're going to start our slew of ping-pong questions. And I say ping-pong because we're going to back and forth between difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan and difficulty Reish Lakish. You can look at the study guide if you want to follow there. Eitivei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, there's a very famous Mishnah in Parah. You might remember we've seen it before, but if not, maybe you'll remember it this time. They were super duper careful about parah aduma, and there's this very crazy situation that they describe about how they got the water from the parah aduma to bring for the parah aduma for mixing it with the ashes in a way that they were ensured that there was no impurity at all. They went to this very high level. Chatzerot hayu b'Yerushalayim. Okay, you can see why there's difficulty in Rabbi Yochanan, because they were so careful not to get impure that they basically did all these precautions. Now, if you're not worried about impurity, then what are you worried about? Okay, if there was no impurity, then you don't have to worry about it. Okay, I see you're asking what I said before in class, that we're not really going to get into this issue about they were not Jews. Okay, now there is an issue if there's no Tumat Oel for non-Jews, but there is an issue if you are mahahil, like you yourself go over the dead bodies. There's some opinion. I'm not going to get into all of it right now. I want to stick with the daf, okay? So you can look up commentaries on this. There were these courtyards in Jerusalem that were built on stone. First of all, stone doesn't accept impurity. And what they wanted to do is block the impurity from coming from below. So what they do, this is something called the halal tefach. If you have a space, let's say there's tum underneath, and then there's space in the ground with at least a tefach of airspace, with a cover above of something that not susceptible to impurity, then the impurity won't go through it. Okay? So they built these houses in a way that there was no impurity. Even if there was impurity underneath, it wouldn't come up. Okay, you can already see the problem, right? They were worried, mipnei kever tahom. Now, what did Rabbi Yochanan say? Right? There was no kever tahom, so why would they be worried about this? Now, this is the crazy part. Okay, they basically took these women who were pregnant. They would give birth there, raise their children there in these courtyards. Like it was like they must have homeschooled them, right? There was no way to leave the area. This is where you were for your life, okay? Until you got to age 7 or 8. At that age, you were big enough to basically go get the water and bring the water for the parah aduma, but not enough yet. Okay, so they wanted to make sure that those kids never got in contact with any impurity. Mivi'im shvarim, they brought these oxen, val gabehem tlatot, and they put a flat door lying on the animal. The kid would sit on top of that. Okay, tinokot yoshvin alehem v'kosot shel even biadam. Now, why would they sit? Why did they put the door? Because that would block any impurity from the ground. Again, it would block impurity is coming up. That would be the space where it would stop at that door. The kids were sitting on top there, so a tumah wouldn't get to them. They would go to the water, where they would get, to the nachal, to the stream. They would take cups of stone, because stone is not susceptible to impurity, fill them up, and then they go back onto the oxen, and then go back and bring the parah aduma waters. Okay, so now what do you see? They were obviously worried about kever tahom. To which they answer, okay, this is, and it's obvious, the whole thing is way extreme. They just did this extreme thing. There was like a special level of purity they wanted to save for the parah aduma, but it's not that you really needed to. Okay, second. Eitivei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Okay, so now we're flipping. Now we're asking Reish Lakish, who said there was a mabul. They found bones in the lishka of the wood. They kept the wood for the temple. It was in the Harabayit. Found this bones. They said, oh my God, we found bones here. Crazy. All Jerusalem, we should say, is impure. Amar Rabbi Shua Ragav took it up and said, how disgraceful would it be to say the whole city of our forefathers is impure? Now he says this very unclear statement. Ayeh metei mabul, where are the ones who died in the flood? Ayeh metei Nebuchadnezzar, where are the ones who died in the time of Nebuchadnezzar? Now, the first way we're going to understand this is, isn't he saying it sarcastically? Again, we're back to the sarcastic. What other, there's no metei mabul, there's no metei Nebuchadnezzar, so what are you worried about? And therefore, we should not make this all impure. Right? Because he was obviously trying to say, we're not going to make this impure. So, how could he say, right? It sounded like he was saying, there's metei mabul, there's metei Nebuchadnezzar, but that makes no sense, because he was saying, we shouldn't make it all impure. So he's basically saying, what? You think there's metei mabul? You think there's metei Nebuchadnezzar? Of course not. Now, the Gemara says, how can you possibly explain it that way? Okay, and that's a difficulty on Reish Lakish, because it's basically saying there were no people who died in the flood that would be buried here. Wait a minute. You can't say, you could maybe say the mabul didn't happen, the flood didn't happen in Israel. You can't say that Nebuchadnezzar didn't kill people in Jerusalem. Of course he did, right? That's where it happened. So that was the destruction of the first temple. Elahavu upaninu. Hachanami havu upaninu. What it must mean is they were there and they were removed. Okay? In other words, where are they? They were obviously taken out of here so that we could build our temple, right? Also the metei mabul were taken out of here just like that. Now, that fits with Reish Lakish. There was a mabul, but they were removed. So then they say, wait, no. It's true that Reish Lakish's whole thing is based on there was a mabul, but it was also based on we have to worry about impurity. And we just said, there were, but they removed them all. So, panu, turning out on a bet, if they remove them already, well then, panu, and they move them already, and then we shouldn't be worried about it. That doesn't fit with Reish Lakish. So they say no. Remember, where are you doing the aduma? Outside Jerusalem. They removed all the dead bodies from the Nebuchadnezzar. They removed them from the mabul. We're in Jerusalem when they built the temple. But they're not necessarily removed outside of Israel. Okay, and that's what Rabbi Yoshua was saying. We're not going to make Israel tameh because these people might have been killed here, but we know they're removed. And therefore, it's not a concern. But when you're doing the aduma, which is burning and slaughtering outside the walls of Jerusalem, that was never removed. And that proves Reish Lakish. Yet in the end, and we answer the question, and we can explain that source according to him. They did die in Israel, and they might be buried there. Just not in Jerusalem anymore because that area was cleaned out. Ikadamre. Third answer is a second version of this difficulty. Okay, the third difficulty is the same source, but it wasn't that Rabbi Yochanan brought it against Reish Lakish. The difficulty, Reish Lakish brings it against Rabbi Yochanan. Eitivei Reish Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan. Now, he reads it as what we thought, one of the things we said before. Right? If Metei Nebuchadnezzar clearly exists in Israel, then obviously Metei Mabul also clearly exists. So how are you going to answer that? You said there was no Mabul. So now they're going to say, Midiria, Hai Kedite, Vahai Kedite. No, you could say each one in its own. Where are the Metei Mabul? They don't even exist. What, you worried about that? They don't exist. What about Nebuchadnezzar? You're worried about them? Oh, they were here, but got removed. And then that's how Rabbi Yochanan could explain, no, there were no Metei Mabul. Just because they're put together doesn't mean we're going to have to explain them both in the same way. Source 4, difficulty number 4. It doesn't tell you, but it's difficulty of Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan. Another difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan. Eitivei. Mikol asher b'charavam metu. What happened during the Mabul? Everybody was killed, right? Other than the ones in the Tevet. So Bishlam al-Didid, Yarav Mabul Eretz Israel. Reish Lakish says, everyone, even the people living in Israel, because the Mabul came to Israel. Mishum hachi metu, that's why they died. El ladida chamai metu. But according to you, why did they die? To which he answers, Mishum havla. Now the Mabul didn't get to Israel, but the Mabul, the waters were boiling, and the steam, the heat of it got to Israel and killed people in Israel. Okay, Kid Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda, Berotchim kilkalu, Berotchim nidonu. They sinned with boiling, and they were killed with boiling. Now, what does that mean? They sinned with semen. They did all sorts of inappropriate sexual relations, and that is hot, and therefore they were punished by heat. Okay, and therefore now we're going to say, so now it's going to be tricky. If the people died in Israel, then aren't they buried in Israel? We'll get back to that later. But in terms of did the Mabul happen in Israel? No, it didn't happen in Israel. It's just that the steam got to Israel. Now, how do we know this has to do with heat? Because what does it say? Vayashoku hamayim. Now we explained by Yishoku Amayim, this is by the Mabul, Yishoku means it cooled down. How do we know they cooled down? Because Kivhatan, in the Megillah, it says, V'chamar HaMelech shachacha. The anger of the king, right, it was boiling anger, and the anger subsided, which means it cooled down. Okay, so the word shoku, like shachacha, means it cooled down. So that's how we know the Mabul happened. It was heat, and that's how it affected people in Israel. Ikadam, right? Some people say, though, no, that wasn't the difficulty. The difficulty was actually, okay, just like we had before, it's flipped. Rabbi Yochanan brings the difficulty on Reish Lakish because, what does it say? Mikol asher b'charava metu. Now, the way we explained it the first time is everything everywhere in the world was dead. But the way charava really means dry land. So everything, even on dry land, died. Where was there dry land if the Mabul got everywhere? Must be, I'm right, Rabbi Yochanan says, because the Mabul didn't get to Israel, and that's why what it's trying to say is even people in Israel died because then that's the dry land. But according to you, the Mabul was everywhere, including Israel. There was no dry land. So what do they say? How does Reish Lakish explain this charava? Charava shaitami kara. What it means to say is, anything that lived on dry land before was killed. What does this exclude? The fish. Okay, there's a famous line. Amai kar le charava. Why do they call it charava? Kedur Rav Chisda da'amar Rav Chisda bedor mabul lo nigzera gzera al dagim shebayam. Shneamar mikol asher b'charava metu v'lo dagim shebayam. Okay, in the door of the generation of the flood, the fish were saved. Because it said b'chol asher b'charava, everything that lived on dry land was killed. Before there was a Mabul. This has nothing to do with was there dry land during the time of the Mabul. No, the Mabul covered the whole world, but the fish didn't die. And some people say, by the way, but the heat, right? The heat was only at the surface; it wasn't down below in the water, and otherwise the fish would have boiled as well. Last difficulty of this type. Okay, we're going to see there's one more difficulty, but this is in the difficulty of the ping pong between the two of them. Bishlam alaman damar. This is the difficulty on Reish Lakish. Bishlam alaman damar lo yara Mabul eretz Yisrael hainu dekam rema hatam. Now, there's this re'im. A re'im is a type of, sounds a bit like a fictional animal. Okay, you might remember that we talked about the Leviathan and these gigantic Yitzurim creatures that existed. This fits in with that theory, that there was a re'im, that they believe there was this re'im that existed, that was giant. Okay, we're going to talk about their giant extreme proportions. Now, if the Mabul didn't come to Israel, we understand the existence of the re'im after the Mabul, because there was no Mabul, that's how it survived. But a giant creature like that can't fit into the Tevet, into the Ark of Noah. So where would it have gone? How would it have been saved if the Mabul got to Israel? So they say to Reish Lakish, you must be wrong. El Laman Damar Yarad, if you say it came to Israel, where was the Re'im during the Mabul and how do you survive? So Amar Rabbi Yanai, Guri Yotech Nisu Bateva. Oh, they're babies they put in the Teva. Okay, the baby Re'im, which were obviously small. I say obviously because they weren't really obviously small, and we're going to see that right now. What do you mean they put the babies in? Listen to what they say about the newborns of the Re'imim. I saw an offspring of a Re'im, a baby one. Bat Yoma was 1 day old. Ready for this? Have Kahar Tavor. It was the height of Mount Tavor. I don't know if you've ever climbed up it, or I climbed up part of it. It's quite high. Okay? V'har Tavor Kamahave. How big is it? Arba'im Parse. 40 parasangs. Okay, parasang is like forget exactly how it compares to a mile, but it's a long distance. Mashcha Ditzavre, the length of its neck, Tlata Parse. Okay, the height of its neck, I guess, is 3 parsaot. Mirbata Deresha, the place where the head sits on the neck, is parso palga, is 1.5 parso wide. Ramakavu Schar Yordana, here's the funny line, when it lets out its feces, once it did that, and it dammed up the whole Jordan. Okay, that's how large the feces was. Okay, so anyway, there's no way you could fit this baby in the Teva. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, I want you to remember, there's difficulty on Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan comes and answers, Rosho hechniso the Teva. Oh, just he put his head in the Teva. So I said, what do you mean? We just said it was 1.5 parasangs. That's still too big for the Teva. Ela rosh chotamo hechniso the Teva. Okay? The head of his nostril he put in. A little bit of it went in and that saved him, which we're going to have to figure out how exactly he stayed attached to the Teva while it was floating around everywhere. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan lo yara Mabul eretz Yisrael. Okay, so first they asked. So now we have an answer to Reish Lakish. Even if the Mabul got to Israel, It basically, thank you. Okay, Caroline's saying AI, whether we trust it or not, I can't say, but the common estimate is about 3.5 miles or 5.6 kilometers for a parasang. Okay, if someone wants to look it up further, but that might be good enough. Okay, so now we have the nostril of the rain was in there, so the Mabul was in Israel, this fits with Reish Lakish, and he was safe like that. So the first question they ask is, Rabbi Yochanan lo yara Mabul eretz Yisrael. Why is Rabbi Yochanan saying that the head, right, he was the one who said the head before we got to the nostril, the head went into the Tevet. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't think that the Mabul was in Israel, which means the Re'im was safe because the Re'im could have been living in Israel. We didn't need to put any part of it into the Tevet. Well, obviously the Divrei Reish Lakish Kamar. He was talking according to Reish Lakish. Okay? He was trying to help explain Reish Lakish, wasn't talking according to him. Wait, but the Teva is floating around. How did the Re'im, the baby Re'im, stay attached to the Teva? Amar Reish Lakish Karnav Kashru b'Teva. Okay, it had horns. They tied the horns to the Teva. Going back to the previous sugya, didn't we just say it was boiling water? So, okay, very nice, the nose is in the Teva, but that's not going to protect you from the boiling water outside. So, to which they ask another question, this is getting more and more unbelievable. Well, how did the Teva go about if it's in boiling water and it didn't get ruined from the boiling water? How did Og, the giant, remember Og, the king of Bashan, how did he survive? How do we know he survived the Mabul? Because in the battle of the 5 kings and the 4 kings in Avram's time, who tells Avram that Lot? Okay, apropos your Midrashim, Becky, I see you're nodding. Apropos your this. So, according to the Midrash, it says, who's the Palit? Palit is someone who escaped from something. Where did he escape from? He escaped from the Mabul. Okay, there was one guy who escaped from the Mabul. It was Og Melech Bashan, and he lived. Obviously, another miraculous thing about him in the world of Midrash, you could do this. He lived even until in the time of Moshe. So he lived from before, from the time of the Mabul all the way to the time of Moshe. It must be there was a miracle. The Teva had a cooling system, okay, the earliest air conditioning, and it cooled down the waters. So anyone who was attached to the Teva, basically, you could say they, in Hebrew you say tafsu tremp, they held on to the Teva, Og and the Re'im, both being giants, right, and they were saved. Okay, very interesting mahalach there. Okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, we have one more question though. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, is a bit of a different kind of question. And we kind of addressed that we had to deal with this issue. Okay, actually, this is not the question we were dealing with. I'm sorry. Within this, we're going to get to an answer to a difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan, even though they don't ask it, which is, according to him, remember, people died there in Israel, so where were they buried? Okay, but they're actually asking this question on Reish Lakish because halopash. But they didn't. There's no trace of them anymore in Israel. How do we know? Because you yourself, Reish Lakish, said to Amar Reish Lakish. So this is why it's a different kind of question, because it's not from some Tanaitic source. It's actually Reish Lakish himself said this. Lamani krash ma mitzula. Why is Babylonia called mitzula, which is the depths? Shekol mitei Mabul nitztalilu sham. Because all the people of the Mabul. Okay, now we're going to imagine this world. The Mabul's going. Everyone kind of siphoned off into Babylonian. All the dead are in Babylonia, according to Reish Lakish. So then what are you worried about? Kever Ta'om? This raises difficulty with the whole theory. And Rabbi Yochanan actually agrees with him, but disagrees with how to get it. Amar Laman Kashma Shinar. Why do we call Babylonia Shinar? There's all these names for Babylonia. Shekomate Midbar Nin Arusham. Okay, Shinar Nin Arusham. Okay, they all got moved over to there. So what's the answer? Now, it might be that they all kind of siphoned over to there, but there must be a few that stayed and got stuck in the ground on the way and must be buried under the ground in Israel. Another drasha on Shinar, not having to do with anything here, just we're getting off on a tangent. Amar Rabbi Avau, lama nikra shma Shinar, shemina'eret ashireha. It takes off the wealth, okay? Anyone who comes there ends up losing their money. But what do you mean? We see wealthy people in Babylonia. How could you say that? It's not true. It doesn't last 3 generations. Okay, any wealth anyone has there was not long-lasting wealth. Amar Rabbi Ami. Now back to the issue of all the people were buried in Babylonia. It's still, we're off on a tangent, but on this tangent that they were all buried in Babylonia. So because of that, Amar Rabbi Ami, if you eat the ground in Bavel, it's like you're eating the flesh of your forefathers. Okay, because they're all buried in the ground there. Tanya Nami Hachi, another braita that supports the statement of Rabbi Ami, who was an Amora, but here's a braita. Also, the shkatzim u'remasim weren't taken into the teva, those creepy crawlers. So it's like you're eating them also. Okay, done with that sugya. Now we're moving on. Seir Mishtalech. Seir Mishtalech, we said, why you're not chayv in chutz for Seir Mishtalech, right? Our whole first sugya, maybe we'll just quick review right now. Till now we were dealing with the chutz migita of the para aduma. There's no issue of chutz. And we basically went through why that is. What is chutz migita? Either a place that wasn't checked for impurity, or it was a place that was inside the walls, or theoretically, we could say Rabbi Yochanan also means, or outside the walls, not facing. So you're doing it in the wrong place, but you're not going to be chayv chutz because it doesn't say al petach ol moed, right? It doesn't have to go to ol moed because it doesn't have to go to ol moed. Chutz is only a din in something that's supposed to go to ol moed. Same with seir mishtalech, okay? And then we went on just to review that part, right? We had the whole machloket of them was based on was the mabul in Israel or not, and then we had these 6 difficulties plus that last one, which was an additional. Okay, 3 against each, and then 1 extra against Reish Lakish. Now we get to the seir mishtalech. According to the Mishnah, the reason why seir mishtalech, if you slaughter it outside the temple, you're not liable for chutz because it's not supposed to go to Ol Moed. We're going to see that, first of all, it's not true, and another braita says we don't learn it from there. So how we're going to resolve it, and with that we'll resolve it and finish our daf. Or a minu. Oh, korban. Maybe you could say korban. It says korban. Shomeani afilu koche berakabayit shenikru korban. Because it says korban in the pasuk, okay, al petcha ol moed lo v'yo lakriv korban l'Hashem. You didn't bring it to ol moed to sacrifice the sacrifice. Now, we usually think korban means sacrifice, but sacrifice could also be a word that's used for anything brought to God, including things brought for upkeep of the temple. So maybe if you bring those outside and do something with them, maybe you burn it outside, maybe you'll be liable. And that would include the seir mishtalech, right? Because it's also not really a korban, but it could be korban here. How do we know that? It says that, how do you know korban can mean other things? Vana krevet korban Hashem. This is when the people fought the Midyanim in the desert in Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, and then they come and Moshe says, why did you take all the booty? And they said, well, we already gave some of it to God. I was like, we can take it because we gave some to God. And there it says korban. It was jewelry and things like that, so it wasn't sacrifices. Talmud Lomar, al petach ol moed lo v'yo. No, but it says al petach ol moed, which would teach us, just like our Mishnah said, mishra oy lavo b'ol moed yatzu koshei bedek habayit she'en ru'im. Things that are for upkeep at the temple don't come into ol moed. They're not brought into ol moed. They don't have to be. Okay. So then they say, okay, fine. So tziat elu she'enam ru'im v'lo tziat seir mishtalech shu ra'oy lavo al petach ol moed. But wait, so that would exclude all bedek habayit except for one, seir mishtalech. Because what happens with the seir? We bring 2 seirim in. We do the goral. It goes into Ol Moed, right? We do the goral, then we do vidoy, confession, and then we take it out. So it's not in the category. Now, this immediately clearly contradicts our Mishnah, which said it's not ra'oi for Ol Moed, and this says it is ra'oi. Talmud Lamar la Hashem, because it says korban la Hashem. That's the word where we learn l'hotzi seir mishtalech she'eno miyuchad la Hashem. It's not for God. It's for us, right? It doesn't go to God. It's not offered up to God in the temple. That's why it's excluded. But totally different reason. So the conclusion is the same, but the reason is completely different. So lo kasha kan kodem hagrala kan lachar hagrala. And the Mishnah is talking about when you're standing after you already did the goral. Then it's not ra'oi to be in Ol Moed anymore. And the Braita is talking about before you did the hagrala, before you did the lottery. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? I told you that you still have to keep it in there for the confession. So they answer, okay, if it was before the confession, then it is supposed to still be in Ol Moed, and then you would need this Braita. This Braita is talking about that. Our Mishnah is talking about if you're at the stage after the vidoy, and then you offer it outside, at that point it doesn't need to be in Ol Moed anymore, and then you can learn it from there. So there's 2 ways to learn it, depending on at what stage you brought it outside. We're going to exempt you either for that reason or that reason. Either which way you're going to be exempt. It's just a matter of where we get it from. And with that, we finish today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.